Hi everyone, and welcome to our first webinar in this series, Reclaiming Security. I'm really glad you've all been able to make this discussion to discuss the need for a human security strategy in the UK. When we planned this series, we had not foreseen that by the time we began it, another full-scale war would be underway and that thousands more people would have been killed and hundreds of thousands displaced. The unimaginable horror that those in Gaza and elsewhere are facing demands a better response and a wholly different approach to security that could stop such wars from reoccurring or escalating. Neither the conflicts in Gaza and Ukraine nor those in Sudan and Yemen and elsewhere have arisen from issues about which policymakers and political leaders were unaware. Their long-standing and ongoing fragilities and injustices were well known and noted. This points to the desperate need for international relations to be done differently, so that security is built on cooperation, dialogue, inclusion and justice, rather than responding to challenges with coercive force and military power. It requires countries like the UK, which seek to have influence in the world, to rethink their ideas of security, putting people and planet at the centre of sustainable national strategies and their actions in the world. National security is high on the government agenda in the UK, and as the title of this webinar series says, we need to reclaim that notion of security from top-down ideas about threats and insecurities that are addressed with power projection and militarism, and find ways of building a global community and individual security that is founded on principles of inclusion, sustainability, and justice. And over the last 3 years, Rethinking Security has been trying to do that, working on a project called the Alternative Security Review to put forward ideas about how security could be conceived of differently and how the creation of security policy could be done differently to reflect human security concerns. We've worked with a research team at Coventry University to canvass public opinion and with civil society groups in the UK and beyond to understand the insecurities faced by those who are either marginalised or experience insecurity, or who indeed are targeted by national security policy. To unpack some of the results of this research and what we hope to achieve with it, Richard, who is the coordinator of Rethinking Security, will talk us through our forthcoming human security strategy. We're also joined by two outstanding campaigners, Anahita and Charlotte, who will respond to these findings and suggest ways that transforming understandings of and approaches to security could have an impact in the UK and beyond. I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn, and after their contributions, we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion. We are in webinar format, so please put direct questions to our panel in the Q&A box. And during the discussion time, I think you should be able to use the raise hand function to ask further questions or make comments. But if there are specific questions you'd like answered, please do pop them in the Q&A. So welcome to Richard. Richard Reeve is the coordinator of Rethinking Security. He's worked in peace and conflict research in the UK, Africa and Western Asia for over 20 years, including as Chief Executive of Oxford Research Group, Head of Research at International Research Fellow at King's College London and Chatham House, and as an Editor and Analyst at Jane's Information Group. So over to you, Richard, to share some more thoughts and insights from the Alternative Security Review.
Thanks very much, Jo, and thanks everyone for joining this webinar. I suppose the title of the webinar poses the question: if we're transforming security, what are we transforming it from? What's our starting point and what's wrong with it? So I thought I'd just start by talking a little bit about the current approach to UK security strategies in the UK and what maybe is wrong with that and where that can be improved. So the UK, like most countries, follows a national security approach. And for the past 15 or so years, we've been having regular national security strategies. But the nation is quite a dual-use word. In one definition, it means the nation, the people. In another definition, it means the nation, the state, the government, the territory. And that's the latter area is really where the national security approach is focused. There's a few things wrong with that and the way it pans out. I mean, firstly, it's very focused on the government, institutions rather than people. It's tends to be very much focused on coercion or dominance as a mechanism to ensure security. In the UK context, it's very exceptionalist in terms of defining the national interest. So rather than being a very geographically defined kind of country where we seek global influence and global control, whatever that means for other people. It also tends to be a very static kind of concept, and that's a lot because we, as a former great power and influential country, have a lot of power, a lot of privilege in the world, and we seek to retain that. So these strategies are very much about retaining control rather than moving towards something better, no matter how unjust or unstable or unsustainable the current order might be. Then they tend to be quite negative, very threats-based responses to threats to the UK rather than trying to achieve something better. They're unsustainable in that they tend to put the benefits of the well-being of the planet, climate towards the end as an afterthought rather than being integral to security. They tend to use or propose quite offensive or militaristic solutions, not just defending the territory, but actually going out and achieving impact through offensive force. And finally, in terms of the way that they're generated, they tend to be very exclusionary. So they're focused on a certain sector of society, elites, the establishment, if you will, who tend to be people with, I wouldn't say the most at stake, but the most to preserve. They don't really ask people in society as a whole. They don't ask those who feel most insecure or most vulnerable what they would prioritize in a security strategy. So they're starting from the top down kind of thing. So that, of course, poses the question, what is the alternative? We've been working with a concept of security called human security, which is around 30 years old. It was developed by people within the UN Development Programme in 1994. Was the first kind of iteration. And it really works rather than just that protection, hard security approach to a threefold definition of security. So number one is similar. It's freedom from fear. How do we protect people from violence or from direct threats to their physical well-being? Secondly, it's broader than that. It's freedom from want. So how do we meet the basic needs of people, their well-being, whether that is food security, the health security, housing, and so on. And thirdly, it goes beyond that as well towards freedom from indignity. So that kind of means their human rights, their rights to democratic involvement. How do you get people involved in their society and their society responsive to them? So that's your definition of security. If we take that human security, then we probably need to accept that we're not currently meeting the security needs people in this country or people of the world, and broaden things out and get a bit ambitious for change. So not static national security of the UK as a leading power in the world that can exert force in its own defined interests, but something that a change strategy that makes a better, fairer Britain, firstly. Secondly, a more equal, secure, cooperative world. And thirdly, a planet that's able to sustain current and future generations on which everything else depends. So three quite interdependent kinds of definitions there. So that's kind of where we've been going with our human security strategy. I like to define it as moving from existential competition, which is very much the basis of the UK's current national security approach, towards existential cooperation. How do we work together to make these things happen. I would say it calls for a different kind of structure and 3 social and ecological compacts at those different levels. Firstly, between the UK government and the people of this country, based on their needs. Secondly, a compact between the UK government and the people of the world to work on what I would call shared security, common interests, doing well for everyone. And thirdly, an ecological compact with the planetary system, so that we have a sustainable security basis for everything else. And those really 3 interlinked levels of security, which I would focus on in human security strategy. But where then do we start? I think rather obviously, with a human security strategy, we need to start with the human. This is one of the things that's gone wrong with current and recent approaches. It doesn't ask people, involve people in defining security. And this is what we've tried to do with the Alternative Security Review project over several years. I won't go into the methodology now because it's quite complex, but we've used all kinds of methods with our partners at Coventry, from big surveys, we've used arts-based methods, we've used interviews, we've used focus groups, we've used roundtables of civil society, we've done things international, we've done things within the UK, really to try and get people involved in talking about security. Because that's how people get involved, how people care. It's how policymakers understand what's really important to people. And from that research, I suppose we can highlight a few things. One is when we ask people to define in their own words or terms what's important to them about security. What we found, two things. One was really that freedom from threat to go about their daily lives. So it's kind of that freedom from fear, protection idea. But also equal to that, or slightly above that, we find economic and financial well-being being in there. So freedom from want is a really big thing. We find there's about 42% of the population tend to define, to prioritize those kind of terms for their security, which is much above when we gave them choices like having a very strong military or defining our place against other countries in the world. So it's quite domestic, it's quite economic, it's quite well-being kind of focus, what people care about. When we ask people what their quality of life kind of most depended on, things they chose included friends to talk to, access to food, to energy, to healthcare, to education. And they also prioritized living in a multicultural society and their freedom of speech. So quite kind of rights-based things, basic services, and community, really what people cared about. When we asked them what kind of things most threatened UK national security, we were surprised actually, because the number one things people identified, and number two, were corruption and the actions of the UK government. So that's quite striking. It wasn't Russia and the actions of other countries. It wasn't migrants undermining our society. It was the actions of the UK government. So that fundamentally highlights lack of trust in the government. I think without trust in government, you can't have very much resilience in society to respond to other threats. And corruption is perhaps indicative of what kind of actions of the UK government people are concerned about. I found that really surprising. Perhaps that just speaks to the context of this year. People also identified pandemics, climate change, economic factors, and Brexit among their factors that the majority of people thought were threatening to this country. Again, some of those closely related to the actions of the UK government. From those, and define 6 principles that one might go forward with on a human security strategy, which we use it to introduce. So one is inclusivity, and that's about how you set up your strategy and how you test it. Unless you're asking people to be involved, unless you're finding out what they really prioritize and need in their own security, you're not going to make a security strategy that actually improves the security of people in this country or abroad. Secondly, solidarity. And this is really key in terms of the idea that no one is safe until we're all safe. You can't build walls and expect people on the other side of them not to resent you or to have some kind of reaction from that. We see that in military international relations. We see it in things like pandemic security, vaccines, nationalism, and so on. It's going to come back and bite. Thirdly, is the principle justice in all things. You can have security that is at the expense of others. It won't be sustainable. You can not apply the rules of international law, and it will come back and bite you. We see all this right now in terms of Ukraine, in terms of Israel, Palestine conflicts. Fundamental injustices, lack of application of international law, coming back to bite us. Fourth, as a principle, sustainability is key. Unless you're acting within the carrying capacity of the planet, and you're respecting the ecosystem, nothing else is going to be sustainable. Not now, not the future. Fifth, accountability. Security tends to be, as policy tends to be made in black boxes, locked rooms. We don't know why, and we don't know what's what. So accountability and transparency are absolutely key in having a strategy that is we're able to evaluate and that takes people's priorities into account. And finally, reflexivity. By that I mean testing our assumptions about what we think makes people secure, what we think works. Reflexivity in terms of understanding the impact of our actions and our policy on people in this country, people in the world, and the planet. Because unless we understand the impact of what we're doing, we modify our behavior. We're not understanding what we're doing, that's not going to work. And that's basically an appeal for humility in security strategy making. We don't have all the answers. Not us, not Whitehall, not the UN, not anyone. We get it by cooperating, by working together, and being humble about what we're actually achieving, realistic about our ambition, and serious about tackling the problems, the insecurity that face people, not just some governments are. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard. That's a great phrase to end on, an appeal for humility. I think that sums it up really well. So next we have Anahita Parsa, who is a policy fellow at BASIC, working primarily on the Inclusive International Security Programme. Previously, she was Programme Manager at the Middle East Treaty Organisation, working on the establishment of a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East, and has also volunteered with other UK-based disarmament organisations. She's particularly interested in exploring the application of intersectional approaches to nuclear diplomacy and their implications for nuclear policy making. And I've asked Anahita to say a bit about what human security offers for international forums and as a way of doing things differently. So over to you, Anahita.
Thanks so much for having me. It's really interesting hearing from Richard a bit more as well about the approach altogether and the findings that you had, speaking to a range of people. I think it definitely offers an alternative way of doing things within international forums. When I think of international forums, I'm thinking conferences of states parties at the UN, track 2 dialogues, roundtables, summits, other kinds of conferences where you see an overlap of diplomats, other state officials, civil society, members of the public who are interested as well. There's a broad range, and they can happen all over. And I think with a human security approach, there are probably like a set of impacts on an interior level, like how they actually impact these forums as forums themselves, and then also like kind of broader implications for our ways of making policy, thinking about security, and practicing diplomacy. I think the fundamental that I take away from it is that it's going to have a much more sincere commitment to diplomacy as the core means of doing things, and kind of stepping away from some of our like more strategic minded things as the core tenet of our priorities. I think our practices in a lot of these spaces then would become a bit more intentionally intersectional. I think there's a difference between happening to have diversity and trying to make a space diverse, and being intentional about why you're doing that. And I think that in multilateral forums, the human security like lens offers a really interesting reflection around this like notion of diversity and its impacts. So I think one thing that most of our field and like different communities of advocacy, activism, and diplomacy have been doing quite well is steadily improving diversity in the room. But I think it's really important that we ask ourselves, like, what actually happens when those people are in the room? Like when you get those, like a seat at the table. If we just continue to basically expect traditionally minoritized voices, once they are given accessibility into that room, to be present at these forums, but solely to reproduce existing ways of traditional security thinking, to make the room more diverse just by being there, and to also just be the kind of new set of people who are representing and speaking on this kind of old school approach to security, there's going to be a very continued disconnect between state security policy, the people in those states, and the people who are representing it, like Richard has mentioned. And I think that a human security approach kind of works to remedy that disconnect a little bit, because if our policy making on a local, national, international level is already trying to be more inclusive, equitable, and accessible by nature, I think it also changes the way that we go about thinking about these international forums as spaces for our policymaking, diplomacy, and thinking. So I think it makes us confront, one, how do these international forums work? Are they actually productive? Are they impactful? Are they decorative? I think some of us could probably say that a lot of the events that we go to, more of the work is happening behind the scenes than when you're actually there. And then by asking those questions, it opens up a space to be a little bit more sincere and intentional about how you transform them for the better, to also coincide with this notion of like human security, whether that be for it to be more intentional and accessible for transnational bridge building across different like grassroots communities who attend, more connections between diplomats and civil society with more kind of tangible direct outcomes from those forums for policymaking. So I think some of the things that come to my mind, for example, are recognizing that most of these international forums happen in kind of the heart of the global north. A lot of the global and local communities that are impacted by these questions of security that we're dealing with in this day and age don't have visa opportunities to be able to go to these forums. They don't have the financial standing to be able to go to these forums. Once they get there, they're then sidelined by this kind of existing traditional approach to how these things work. And also the very like kind of traditional notion of what diplomacy looks like. So I think these are all things that are there for reflection. And I think a human security approach kind of brings you into a reckoning of thinking how we tackle that and shape that for the better. And I think that that strengthens democratic processes overall as well, especially for the UK. And I think that it also just kind of on a wider level gets us to rethink what diplomacy looks like. I think there's kind of a resigned thought that diplomacy is this perfected art form, but I think we're at this stage where we should be recognizing that it, as a practice, diplomatic practice should be changing, growing, transforming as time goes on, and as these rooms become more diverse, and as our thinking about security changes, because we've got new obstacles, new opportunities, new challenges, that kind of thing.
Thank you. I really like the idea that international relations done with sincerity is really important. putting that at the heart of what human security practically means. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Charlotte just after introducing her. So Charlotte Cooper is Peace Lead for Quakers in Britain, a radical faith community committed to working for equality, peace and climate justice. For several years, she has been researching and campaigning against UK defence and security policies that violate human rights, including campaigns to end the recruitment of under-18s by the British Armed Forces and to repeal counter-terrorism policies such as PREVENT. And I've asked Charlotte to speak particularly to her work as an activist and how and why human security is a helpful concept for peace activists, as well as share some ideas about the impact that it might have in campaigning. So over to you, Charlotte.
Thanks, Jo, and thanks for having me. Yeah, I think human security can be a useful concept for campaigners in lots of different ways, but I'll try and limit myself to a few. And then at the end, I'm also going to discuss a couple of risks or challenges we might need to be aware of as well in using human security language. So to start with the positives, what it can give to peace campaigning, I think human securities can be really powerful in sort of challenging or even claiming a bit of the powerful nature of the language around security. So if we think about the kind of work that security does in UK political debate and in government policy, it's often like things that are described as a security issue tend to be allocated like seemingly unlimited resources and political will, and that goes relatively unchallenged. So as an example, you could think about the way that it's really hard for any politicians, and in fact, very few politicians do say that maybe we need to spend less on the military, or perhaps we could do with a smaller army, because these things are seen as necessary for our security, and therefore that can't be challenged. So where human security can be helpful for campaigners is challenging, well, actually, is that stuff making us feel more secure? Actually, that's quite an elite, state-centred, as Richard alluded to, version of security. And we can advocate for some of those vast resources and political will to instead be going to the kind of things that evidence shows make people feel more secure, such as economic well-being, addressing the impacts of climate change, that kind of thing. The second kind of benefit I wanted to talk about to using a human security concept is the way it can help us as campaigners make connections between different issues. So instead of separately thinking about perhaps campaigning against nuclear weapons or drones or the many issues that occupy us as peace campaigners, we can, human security really encourages to start to think about what's wrong with the underlying approach. And that's basically questions of, whose security is this prioritizing? Who's written this policy? Is it actually working? Is the evidence there? And I think it's particularly helpful in helping us make connections outside of what would have traditionally been considered peace issues. So those kind of questions, I think, naturally lead you away from just issues of opposition to war and weapons, and also towards questions of justice. And so if we're questioning who security policy works for and who it might actually be making more insecure, I think that helps us really connect with issues of economic justice, global justice, climate justice, migrant justice, and help us get out of perhaps peace movement niches. So I think it can help us try and bring these questions of why we might need to rethink security policy to other movements and help build alliances and connect with those other questions. And the final point I wanted to make about its benefits is that it can help us articulate a vision. So perhaps rather than just having to work on our individual issues, we get to stick our head above the parapet of thinking about campaigning against the arms trade or campaigning against PREVENT, and start to think about what it would really look like if security policy actually centered people and planet. And I think we really need that vision in order to feel like we have something to nourish us. We're not just constantly moving between campaigning against bad things, but we've got something compelling to bring people along with us and motivate us. So I find it really inspiring in that regard as well. In terms of the risks and challenges, I know some people are quite questioning of whether, even if we're using security in a kind of expansive human security sense, we need to be aware of the fact that there's a lot of really powerful actors out there, like the military, arms companies, the whole security sector, using security in their own sense and trying to like use it to bring things under their own purview. So we could take climate change as an example. I think most Rethinking Security Network members would agree that climate breakdown is a massive threat to human security. That, you know, it's a big threat to the safety and thriving of people and planet. And so security policy could very reasonably be directed at mitigating climate change and helping people adapt to its impacts with like a justice lens. But the security sector is also describing climate change as like a threat to security, but with a very different conclusion. So for them, describing it as a security issue leads to the conclusion that they should be taking a leading role in the response. So that we might actually just need bigger military budgets, that the military might be needing to be involved in like keeping out climate migrants or protecting supply chains for global corporations. So yeah, there's this issue of, if we're using the language of security but in a different way, are we going to win on the definition, or are those other actors perhaps going to win out? And for that reason, some people say we shouldn't even be describing climate breakdown as a security issue at all. We should be describing it as a justice issue, for example. And for similar reasons, I've heard some communities who are often like at the sharp end of security policy. So like in my work on counterterrorism measures in the UK, working with some Muslim communities, some people in those communities just aren't comfortable with the use of security language at all, because again, they think we won't sort of win on the definition. And I think those things don't lead me yet to the point of saying we shouldn't be using the language of human security, but I'm really interested to unpick that as a network, and we'll be interested to hear what participants on the call think as well. I think they're just risks and challenges we need to be aware of, and perhaps think about other kinds of language we can also be using, which might have some of the power of security, but not have as much of its negative trappings, like safety, for example. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. That's been a really helpful insight into how the language of security works and the risks associated with it, but also what using the concept of human security could do for activists in the UK, building alliances and working together. So thank you all for those really insightful contributions. I want to move to the questions and discussion now. We have a few questions. I'm going to put us in gallery view. And I also have loads of questions, but I'll keep those just now and start with the questions in the Q&A. And if anybody has more, please do add them. And I will also shortly try and enable the raise hand function so that we can have a bit more of a discussion. So there's two for Richard, actually, around the research methods. Georgia Nash, I'm wondering how you ensured respondents came from a broad spectrum of political views, and were these views true across people from different social strata, urban, rural, and political orientations. Do you want to give us a bit more insight into the methodology? I know you said that this might not be the place to go into it in depth, but it's really interesting questions. And then I'll come to the other questions.
Yeah, happy to. So we used a lot of different methodologies. Most of the data that I was referring to is from surveys conducted, designed by our colleagues at Coventry University and conducted by Savanta, commercial polling company. So the advantage of that is that they use a representative panel across the country, so representative by age, location, by ethnicity, religion, political affiliation, all these kind of criteria. So that you do 2,000 is kind of a magic number in surveys. You do 2,000 respondents from their panel, which is representative nationally, and in theory, you get representative answers. So that's what we did there. We did actually two, because one for 18 to 30-year-olds and one for 30 to 75-year-olds. So we could compare the results between younger people and older people. There's a lot of commonality between those. Some differences. I mean, young people tend to give greater significance to a lot of factors across the board. Maybe old people are a bit more apathetic about something. Young people see more possibilities of change. We can also break this down by all kinds of other factors, like you look at the gender, some significant differences between, for example, men and women on some different factors. In economic factors, for example, tend to be cited more by women than men as a definition of insecurity. A range of things that female respondents identified in terms of valuing visibility, protection, sort of enclosed spaces as sort of protective spaces, for example. In climate, see women respond to more interested in the men, for example. But there's all kinds of breakdowns within the data that you can do between all kinds of demographic identity-based criteria.
Thank you. I hope that was helpful regarding the research methods, and particularly how the polling was done and how we ensured that non-biased input. We have another couple of questions about the research methodology, but I'm going to come to those in a little while. There's a few more questions that I think would be great to hear from all of you, actually, on the panel. So Frank Bolton from MedAct, as well as XORG and Quakers. One aspect of security which I identify as, not surprisingly, health. How do you think we can increase resilience in the face of, say, climate change? And I'd like to ask that to Anahita and Charlotte and Richard as well, because I think resilience, making us more secure in the face of climate change, for example, and Frank's interested in health. Like, are there examples of where you've seen that? How do you think that might be done through a human security lens? Anahita first. Maybe.
So I think I'm cautious about how I answer this, because I'll admit I'm not necessarily an expert, especially on, like, for example, global health. But I think from the nuclear weapons field that I'm kind of more primarily sat in, there's been an increasing rhetoric that I think gains traction, especially within advocacy efforts and with the general public, to kind of highlight the very clear and distinct links between all these different existential threats and the way that our states choose to tackle them. So I know that Charlotte, for example, mentioned that certain things, there are intersections that need to be addressed. And I think that that's also fundamental to think about. Long term and midterm, I think one of the main tenets of a human security approach would be divestment from military spending. It would be a reduced involvement in the arms trade, and it would be divestment towards social welfare, strengthening the NHS, and probably, when thinking about security, and foresight in terms of how we can best protect our people and our communities, and in turn state relations as well. One of those things I think about often is pandemic preparedness, vaccine universalization, vaccine equity, that kind of thing. And I think from the kind of traditional security element of it, it's a lot about building the kind of prevalence of that link in public mindset, and for people to be able to make that link, that the reason that I'm not getting this adequate, for example, health support within the healthcare system right now is because there's an explicit decision being made to put less funding into that and more funding into military spending, and through that maybe trying to kind of lobby for better decisions around that. But I think I'm really curious to hear what everyone else has to say about that, because I'm not an expert.
Thank you. That's helpful, of course. Charlotte, do you want to answer that as well?
Yeah, I'd add that I'm also not a health expert, and if the question askers from Medact, I'm sure they'd have some probably more valuable thoughts than me. But I think in terms of a human security approach to health and in relation to climate change, I think that will be about policy that prioritizes like urgent and rapid mitigation. Like we know that every decimal point of a degree massively matters for the impacts we're going to see. So kind of urgent political will to mitigate the causes of climate change, I think hugely important for health. Similarly, just kind of securing like a sustainable, healthy food supply through sustainable farming, and kind of like challenging the way industrial agriculture is really tied to the interests of massive corporations at the moment. I think those kind of things are going to be really important for health resilience. I think in terms of health security more generally, outside of just the interaction with climate change, I know Medact have done some really interesting work on points where hard security needs to get out of the healthcare system because it's actually increasing ill health. So for example, preventing healthcare, discouraging a lot of people from engaging with health services, or meaning that their experience is much worse.
Thank you. Drawing on some of those examples is really helpful as well. And Richard, do you want to add anything to that?
Just make 2 points on Frank's question. One is just the resilience question. It's really key. I mean, if 3/4 of the population see the actions of the UK government as a threat to the national security of this country, and see corruption as a significant challenge, we've got a huge problem in terms of government actions. And obviously, you saw a lot of this in terms of pandemic, people's willingness to take up the vaccines, conspiracy theories, and so on. It doesn't help if the government is seen to be fundamentally dishonest, unfortunately. Secondly, in terms of maybe health outcome review, if we apply the principle of solidarity to health security, things like vaccine internationalism rather than vaccine nationalism is a key thing. We need to put the interests of humanity being vaccinated and prepared as key to things like pandemic security, which hasn't gone away. We've experienced one, but we'll have others to come, maybe worse.
Yeah, I think it's a great question around resilience. I'm going to move on because we have quite a lot of questions coming in, and I kind of want to ask two that I hope will be a bit related that have popped up a couple of times in the Q&A, and ask each of you about your response. So the first is anywhere that you have seen or have examples of where a human security approach is used, or security is practiced in a more human sense. I guess that could apply maybe in the UK in some alliances that have been built, but also in international forums, and where you might have seen that, Anahita. And then another question that's come up a couple of times on the definitions, and that interest in how we define things. How can we kind of keep hold of this concept of human security and not let the narrative be co-opted by the national security agenda? And I think I wanted to bring them both together because I feel like at the moment we often talk about this polycrisis that we're in, that there's so many different threats, a government that, as Richard has pointed out, a lot of people in this country have lost trust in, and that yeah, as we face all these different kind of security threats, what shifts are taking place in the UK government, or this, I guess, this kind of exceptionalism that Richard mentioned? What do we do in a more complex, chaotic world where it's not as easy for the global north to kind of keep control of a narrative and an idea of security that allows them to retain control? So that's some of my questions and thoughts mixed in with some of the ones that have appeared in the Q&A box. Maybe this time start with Richard, and then Anahita, then Charlotte.
It's this question of language, which I think is important. I mean, yes, we've kind of gone full blown in terms of using security terminology when we talk about reclaiming security from this very coercive definition, which has been dominant for a long time. We'll be centering that on people, on the humanity element. I would describe it, rather than securitizing humanity, which has been what's been going on, particularly in the last 20 years, kind of global war on terrorism kind of context, to humanizing security. Because it matters to all of us, all this stuff. We each have genuine, interests in our own well-being, our own protective security, all these things. I think we can talk about, and I like the human security approach in terms of the multifaceted approach that you have to really think about in all kinds of contexts. Yeah, in terms of where I think we can draw good practice from, no country that does it perfectly. Some people like to talk about Costa Rica, for example, as a country that has abolished its armed forces and puts all those financial resources that it would spend on coercive security into healthcare and environmental protection things. That's a pretty good example, to be honest, but it's a pretty small scale one. And we can also look at other countries in Europe. Finland has been a good example. Interesting example. One, his strategy does have these kind of three spheres of people and community, national security, and the international planetary security. But also interesting because it's actually quite a militarized society in some ways. It has conscription, has a very clear definition of threats coming from Russia, but actually hasn't put all its resources into that, and has managed to put all kinds of resources into healthcare, into economic well-being, and has quite a different kind of social contract, I suppose, to what we have in the UK. But even here in the UK, I think we can draw good examples from, for example, Scotland or Wales. And devolution has been quite productive in generating a marketplace or a diversity of ideas about all kinds of things, including the future generations policy in Wales, for example, rather different approaches to health and social security in Scotland, to name but two. But also, as I said, that generally it's this idea of UK exceptionalism, that we do things, that we have a legitimate place in the world that other countries don't have. We behave in certain ways that are legitimate for us, but wouldn't be for others. And that is one of the key assumptions that we have to rethink about security to have a human-centered approach.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Lots of good examples. Anahita, would you like to comment on that?
Thanks. I'll try and really quickly cover the kind of like 3 points. I think in terms of places, Richard took some of the first places that came to mind for me as well. Costa Rica is a big one. I think they come to the forefront of my mind because when I'm in a lot of these like spaces for arms control, disarmament, diplomacy, non-proliferation, that kind of thing, Costa Rica is always in that room, and they're very much oriented towards a human security kind of themed approach around disarmament, commitment to peace building, and commitment to like very meaningful diplomacy and relationship building. So they're quite an interesting example. I think in international forums, it's been really visible within the disarmament community. I think there's such a broad range of civil society groups that come to some of these forums and conferences and events that also cover other existential threats like climate, like health. And there's a lot of cohesive action and organizing amongst these groups on a global and national level, people coming from different countries together to build recognition of the overlap of their existential threats. And to also push for certain kinds of narratives to be more at the forefront of our thinking. So I think I can see some tangible impacts of that. For example, the nuclear field has gotten a lot better at talking, at the very least, about decolonization, racism, and colonial legacies within nuclear policymaking. I think that would have been unheard of a couple years back. But I think that that's quite a direct outcome from the push of civil society work and academia and expertise that has brought it into the forefront of nuclear psyche. And you can see like funded opportunities, grants for civil society to work on that and give their research and consultation to states. And also, I guess, even like there was a paper recently, an increasing research about the interlinkage between climate and nukes, not just that nuclear weapons are bad for the climate, but that the climate crisis poses threats to our nuclear arsenals. For nuclear weapon states and nuclear armed countries, holding on to this traditional idea of deterrence, they've not really covered their bases in thinking, well, with extreme weather events, with really, really unforeseen kind of impacts by the climate crisis, we don't know whether our nuclear arsenals are as secure and safe as they would have been. And that's really pushed some states into having to think about what that means for the future and whether they might have to rethink even their ideas about deterrence or just kind of move towards something else. And I think in terms of the comment about exceptionalism and stuff, I think that's a really interesting point. And I think it kind of, for me, one of my questions about human security as an approach and an agenda is, I think it ultimately falls to your belief system as well about how the system functions, why it functions in the way it does. So I think that there's been quite a natural decoupling in history of like strategy and ethics as two like separate entities that are almost at times mutually distinctive. And our governments have to make really tough decisions about our military like safety, our military security, sometimes at the cost of like certain ethical values, certain moral principles, and even our commitments to international law. And I think it depends. Do you think that that's a deliberate thing that's happened and a deliberate pattern that continues? Or do you think that that's just kind of a difficult outcome of our existing like security approaches? Regardless of like which you think, I think it is still very much apparent that that happens. And I think that we're at a point in time where we're leaning towards a multipolar international system. We're seeing that great power struggles are changing in the way that they exist. Other states have been able to come to the forefront of the international system and challenge some of these hierarchies and power structures. And I think that that now puts us in a place where it's time to confront our priorities and to maybe adopt this idea of thinking about human security as a more central kind of tenet of our views on security, whether that be as communities or as states. Because in turn, if you're centering people and the safety and security of all communities, instead, including traditionally minoritized ones and disadvantaged communities, that's naturally going to change our priorities and center a better commitment to ethics. And I think that that can tackle some of the like questions that, for example, Richard raised about the UK's role, like as a historically at times harmful power, and one that does have colonial legacies, one that does have a history of harms caused to a range of communities locally and beyond. And I think that that also kind of like contributes to this question of like definitions. I think it's good to get to a place where we're at least thinking about it, and then we kind of think about definitions next.
Thank you. And that's really, really interesting to hear about the kind of discussions that are happening in international forums on nuclear disarmament and nuclear weapons. Charlotte, would you like to add anything to that?
Just very briefly on positive examples, because I know we're running out of time. I've heard of some interesting ones, like localized things in parts of the US where, like, stimulated by the Black Lives Matter movement, now there's, like, instead of like a policing response to like community or mental health crises, there's now like a civilian, like, mental health care one. And I think that's just an interesting prompt to think about. We don't always need to be looking for alternative security approaches always at the like international or national level. We can also look at where the kind of seeds of them are being grown locally and how that can build a kind of support for a different approach and inspire people to think differently about the response to things that our kind of political discourse might want us to see as threats. I'm thinking about some kind of local Quaker work, just starting like peace education in schools, or organising like compassionate, justice-based responses to migrants arriving in their communities. And I think, the more we can get those going and have that kind of like inspiring stuff starting on a manageable local level, the more that can feed change higher up.
Thank you. Another great answer, full of really concrete examples, which is fantastic. I know we have a lot of other questions and we're not going to get to them all, but I wondered, in very, very quick summary, we've had a few questions around narrative creation, definition, how we make this approach attractive. What's your top tips on that? Maybe Anahita, Richard, then Charlotte. Very quickly.
I think it's a lot about tackling this idea that security, whether national or international, is this big, bad, scary thing that you leave to your governments to deal with. And it's not your place as a member of the general public or as a member of civil society to comment or to contribute to the decision-making or to define what security means. I think once you try to bridge that and you try to get to that kind of like belief that seems to be really instilled, you can then make space to start to have some safe and meaningful conversations about what those definitions need to look like. Do we move away from that? Do we work within the existing system or outside of it to do that?
Thank you. Brilliant summary, Richard.
I think definitions are key. And one of the criticisms of national security strategies is they very rarely define what they mean by security. Who are they making safer? How are they doing it? What does it mean? How can we be sure that it's happening? And that lets people off the hook. If we can define through conversations, through getting people involved in security policy, that it matters to them, that it's going to address the issues that matter to everyone has a stake in this, then it becomes popular. Politicians have to respond to what is important to people. And that's why we have to remove this black box around security policy and get people talking about it, because then it has to matter. And we have to evaluate whether what we're doing works. If it doesn't work, and in the last 20 years in particular, have really not worked, then we've got to do something different, something better.
Thank you. Charlotte.
Yeah, just to echo what the others said, really, I think a lot of people go through life without really thinking about like the defence sector or security policy or those sorts of functions of our government, and just opening up the conversation, starting it with groups and people that probably aren't thinking about it now. And that's an essential bedrock to kind of build a narrative and support for change.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's been a really great discussion, some really insightful comments and great questions as well. I'm really pleased that you were able to attend this and hear a bit more about what human security could look like in these different forums. We're going to continue with this webinar series monthly until February. The second one is on Wednesday, the 6th of December. We will be discussing global human security, cooperation, common security and the climate with another excellent group of contributors. And the webinar falls during COP28 and just after the UN's second meeting of state parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So you'll be able to get some real-time reflections on some of the most pressing global human security issues. So I highly recommend coming along to that one. Just check out the webpage and the registration link is in the chat. It's not in the chat, it's on the webpage. And I'll put the webpage in the chat now. We have plenty of other resources coming out for the Alternative Security Review. So please do keep an eye on the website or sign up as a supporter of Rethinking Security to keep up to date on what's happening. But yeah, it's great to have so many of you here, and thank you for your contributions and discussion. And a final huge thank you to the contributors for their really, really insightful comments tonight. Thank you so much for being with us, and have a good evening, everyone. Bye.